In 1776, the United States was a collection of 13 weak colonies hugging the Atlantic coast. Yet, in what is basically the blink of an eye, historically speaking, it became an unrivaled global superpower. It's tempting to look at that trajectory as inevitable. We often assume this rapid ascent resulted from American ingenuity, the spread of democracy, or a relentless march of progress. But to see how this country actually built its massive economic engine, we have to look past the mythology. We need to use a materialist approach, casting away illusions and following the concrete flow of property, capital, and labor. When you track the money instead of the myths, America's status stops looking like a miracle. It looks like the result of a highly efficient, unbroken chain reaction of exploited labor and compounding capital. That chain reaction begins in the antebellum South. The ruling capitalist class in the U.S. has its roots in the slave trade, which provided the massive initial accumulation of wealth that financed the nation's early development. This chart captures the scale of that economy. Enslaved labor produced roughly 60%, 3/5, of all the wealth in the South, primarily through the mass production of cotton. This output was so vast that it dominated the entire national GDP. This wealth followed established paths of national commerce, moving beyond the plantations and across regional borders. Human chattel functioned as the primary economic engine for the entire country, generating the financial liquidity required to fund the next stage of American development. This massive southern wealth flowed north, financing the early infrastructure of the broader United States. Southern profits allowed northern capitalists to build textile mills, banks, and universities. The American Industrial Revolution was bankrolled by the plantation system. This capital funded the Erie Canal and early railways, creating networks to move goods to the Midwest. The shift was rapid. Within a few decades, the United States moved from an agrarian society to a mechanized manufacturing hub, launching steamboats, manufacturing companies, and the Erie Canal in quick succession. The physical landscape of the North changed. Suddenly, dangerous and highly profitable factory systems began dominating the skyline. The Northern Industrial Revolution relied on the South for its foundational capital. It was the direct financial beneficiary of enslaved labor. A growing industrial machine requires endless resources. This demand drove the ideology of westward expansion, pushing the nation's borders to the Pacific to secure new land and raw materials. To staff these exploding urban manufacturing centers, the United States required a massive, continuous supply of cheap labor. Millions of European immigrants fleeing poverty and famine arrived with nothing but their ability to work for a wage. They were joined by hundreds of thousands of African Americans moving north in the Great Migration, fleeing racial violence and debt peonage for factory jobs. The census data shows the numerical impact of this movement. Between 1860 and 1920, the urban population grew from 6 million to over 54 million as workers moved into industrial centers. Rapid urbanization created a grim reality. This new, highly segregated wage labor force lived in poverty-stricken, disease-ridden slums spanning narrow city alleys. The physical infrastructure of the superpower was built on the backs of an exploited, easily replaceable class of urban workers. By the late 19th century, the industrial engine was overproducing. The United States lacked new internal frontiers, and domestic markets were saturated with goods. This surplus forced a pivot. The U.S. moved away from isolationism, seeking new overseas markets to sell goods and secure a steady flow of raw materials. The government used its economic clout to force an open-door policy, aggressively expanding American trade into East Asia. Protecting these new international assets and trade routes required the rapid development of a global military. America's entry onto the world stage was driven by a strict mathematical necessity, the need to feed its unstoppable industrial engine. The chain is unbroken. Human chattel generated the seed capital. That capital built the factories. The factories demanded a new labor force, and the surplus from those factories forced global expansion. This process resulted in immense national wealth, yet it remained concentrated in the hands of the ruling class, while the workers who produced it faced steady declines in their own living standards. Viewing history through this materialist lens shows that modern economic inequality is a logical extension of these early choices. The mechanisms used to concentrate capital in the 19th century continue to shape the distribution of wealth today. African Americans, whose forced labor was the foundation of this wealth, have spent a century fighting for basic survival and civil rights within the very system they built. The American superpower was forged by a brutal and highly efficient supply chain of exploited labor, and we are all still living inside the blueprints of that machine today.